we have been taking a deep dive into our right to clean and healthy waters amendment to the Florida Constitution, and we've been doing that with very, very knowledgeable people. I want to introduce two of them to you right now. One you are familiar with if you have been popping in these last few weeks, and that is Melissa Martin. Let me tell you a little bit about Mel. Mel is an attorney and Florida native from the Wekiwa Springs area, and she earned her Bachelor of Science degree from the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis and served as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Marine Corps. A few years in, she earned her law degree from Barry University School of Law. In 2014, she retired as a Marine Corps staff judge advocate and moved back with the family to Brevard County, where she advocated for good government, environmental conservation, and clean water in various leadership roles. She taught at Barry Law as an adjunct law professor on the subjects of water pollution law and environmental ethics. Mel recently moved with her husband and children to Eugene, Oregon, from where she telecommutes and volunteers her time for the success of this initiative. Mel, thank you for being with us today. And also with us today is Maya Van Rossum. Maya, thank you for joining us. A little bit about Maya, everybody. Maya is the founder of the Green Amendment for the Generations movement. She's a Delaware River keeper. I think she's been a Delaware River keeper for about 30 years, and leader of the Delaware River Keeper Network. She's the author of the Green Amendment, the People's Fight for a Clean, Safe, and Healthy Environment. The second edition came out this past November. A couple other things that I like to mention: she was the 2020 River Hero by the River Network. She received the Giraffe Hero Award given to those people who have the courage to stick their neck out for the common good, and I like that one, Maya. She has testified by invitation 3 times before the U.S. congressional committees. Both of you, again, thank you for being here. Just before we go to questions, I'd like to provide a little environmental context for the reason that we're here, for the reason that we are advocating this amendment. Here in Florida, our waterways are in poor to absolutely critical conditions. No state has more acres of polluted lake water than does Florida. We are number 1. We have 1,000 springs, world famous springs. 80% of them are polluted. Many of them are suffering very significant reductions in flow. We have nearly 1 million acres of estuaries and 9,000 miles of rivers and streams contaminated with fecal bacteria. I live down here in Southwest Florida. Right now we have red tide off our coasts. It's off the coast from Tampa Bay all the way down to Key West. I read there very recently, to the Keys. It has exploded over the last 30 years. There are 50,000 tons of legacy phosphorus sitting at the bottom of Lake Okeechobee, exacerbating blue-green algae blooms, and those have been connected with neurodegenerative diseases. Our seagrass beds are on the brink of going into a death spiral, which is why so many manatees have died in the last 18 months. Florida Rights and Nature Network, which is the organization that has started this initiative, would not have done so unless there wasn't great need and unless this amendment language hadn't been thoroughly vetted by legal experts, no less than 3 in Florida constitutional law. So that's why we're here. That's why we are pushing this amendment. And I'd like to ask both our knowledgeable folks here today some questions. Maya, can we start with you? Thank you.
I guess you're going to start with me. That's awesome.
All right. So what brought you to become such an advocate for the Green Amendments? I mean, you're working on a national scale. What brought you to this point?
So in my role as the Delaware River Keeper, in the context of battling against fracking, we actually, we meaning my Delaware River Keeper Network and I, were actually able to achieve a very powerful success defeating a very pro-fracking law that was going to allow the industry to expand exponentially. And we achieved that victory because we had in the Pennsylvania Bill of Rights a long ignored but existing constitutional right to pure water, clean air, and a healthy environment. We achieved that victory in December of 2013, and very literally defeated this pro-fracking law, but at the same time achieved this very powerful legal decision that gave incredible power and legal life to this long ignored environmental rights provision. You know, I was able to see in that moment how powerful having a constitutional right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment that meets critical criteria that lift up environmental rights so they are protected as powerfully as the other fundamental rights we hold dear. I was able to see how powerful that was, and that we were able to accomplish this amazing, important victory because of that amendment. Right? We would not have achieved this victory but for that constitutional entitlement. And so it was in the wake of that victory, recognizing how powerful and significant the accomplishment was, I recognized that we needed this kind of protection in every state across our nation. At the time, only one other state had that kind of protection. That was Montana. But I sort of have decided to dedicate myself to trying to get that highest level of protection in every state across our nation and ultimately at the federal level, because it does allow us to achieve critical environmental protections that otherwise are unachievable.
So there are other states that have green amendments and that are pursuing green amendments.
So at this point, so we have Pennsylvania and we had Montana. Last year went into effect New York's Green Amendment, which we secured as a result of 4 years of advocacy and a vote of the people in November of 2021. So it officially went into effect in January of 2022. And there too, we are already seeing really powerful progress, environmental protection, and people accomplishing critical protections that up until having their Green Amendment were evading them. We have Green Amendment proposals in about 10 other states, with half a dozen more states at least, where we are working with folks organizing to make this happen. Of course, leader of the pack is the state of Florida, with your very powerful, what I call Green Amendment protections, but it's really the Florida Right to Clean Water campaign. We also have a proposal, powerful proposal in Hawaii, in Maine, in New Mexico, in New Jersey, in Delaware, and there are more. We have a proposal that's just come out this week in the state of Nevada, and one that's just come out in the state of Texas. We have one in Iowa, and I won't keep going on, but I think by naming those states, I think what I'm hoping what people see is that we really have a diversity of kinds of states that are seeking this highest constitutional recognition and protection for our environmental rights, and that it really does not matter what your political disposition is personally or as a state. Everybody recognizes that we need a right to clean water and a healthy environment, and people recognize that these fundamental human rights are entitled to highest constitutional protection. And so they're working just like you are in Florida to get it.
So what makes a green amendment, specifically a green amendment, in your mind? And aren't there other states that have environmental protections at a constitutional level? Do they all qualify as green amendments in your point of view?
So every Green Amendment is an environmental rights amendment, but not every environmental rights amendment is a Green Amendment. A Green Amendment is a unique kind of amendment that fulfills critical criteria, and as a result, lift up environmental rights so they are given the same highest constitutional recognition and protection as the other fundamental rights we hold dear, right? We always, what I say is we all know how powerfully our right to free speech, freedom of religion, how powerfully our property rights are protected because of their constitutional standing. Well, that highest protection now gets given to the environment when you have an amendment that fulfills Green Amendment criteria. So there are a number of criteria that make an environmental rights amendment a green amendment. There are some must-haves and there's some really great to haves. But amongst the must-haves is that the language has to be in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. That's where we recognize and protect all those other human, civil, and political rights we hold dear. If we want our environmental rights to have that same highest constitutional standing and protection, they have to be protected in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. The language has to be self-executing, meaning it has legal enforceability in its own right. And it has to be clear that it really is lifting up environmental rights to that highest standing. So it has to be clear that we are protecting things like clean water. So ideally, the language will be generational so that we're protecting these rights for present and future generations. And that ensures government thinking has, is thinking, or government decision-making is doing it from a perspective of protecting things in the long term. So those are just some of the critical essentials. Those essentials all are being fulfilled by the right to clean water. And so the right to clean water will be given that highest constitutional standing if the Florida Right to Clean Water proposal is actually passed. To speak to your second part of the question, Joe, you're right. I mean, the truth is almost every single state constitution talks about the environment. Some even talk about environmental rights within the body of the Constitution. But it is only Pennsylvania, Montana, and New York that fulfill the critical criteria that give environmental rights that highest, most powerful recognition and protection and standing. What we have in other states is, first off, the language is not located in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. Bill of Rights placement isn't just where language sits within the Constitution. There are actually critical legal protections that come into action to protect the rights that are recognized in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. I'm not going to go into it because it's all legalese stuff, but it's powerful and it's important. The other states, they have their language, for example, in the miscellaneous section of the Constitution, like it's an afterthought. And really, the truth is, it's probably because it is. Or, what they will say is, the people have a right, and then they'll say some really beautiful things, but they'll say they have a right to a healthy environment, but that's the policy of the state. Policy is advice under the law, right? You don't actually have to listen to it. And so really the language itself undermines the right just within the terms that are included in the amendment. Or the language will say people have a right as defined by the state legislature. What that really is saying is that the people have a right to have their legislators legislate around the environment. But as long as their legislators are passing legislation, even if that legislation does not result in critical environmental protections, their constitutional duty and the people's constitutional right to have them legislate has been fulfilled, but nothing has changed, right? Legislators already legislate all the time. It's the quality of the legislating that really matters. And green amendments help we, the people, be able to ensure that the quality of what our government officials are doing is higher and gives us the level of protection we need. And then some of the states, they protect things like the right to navigate waterways, or the language says what you're entitled to is that your government officials are going to set aside money to protect natural open space. These may all be fine things, but they're not protecting the essentials of life. And then you have other pots where the language, like in New Mexico, the existing language in the miscellaneous section of the Constitution says that the government it talks about the environment being of fundamental importance to the people. And then what it says the government is required to do, or the legislators are required to do, is legislate for pollution control and control of the despoilment of the environment for the beneficial use of the people. You can hear there, the focus is not protecting the right of the people to clean water, clean air, and a healthy environment. The focus is where the focus is pretty much in all environmental protection laws in Florida and across the nation. The focus is on legalizing pollution by regulating it, not preventing it. Right. So it's different everywhere, but the long and the short of it is, if it's not in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, if it's not focused on these essentials of life, if it's not self-executing, if it doesn't fulfill all of the Green Amendment criteria that I lay out in the book and on the website and in other places and spaces, then it's not giving the environment that highest constitutional standing that we the people need. And we the people have no ability to do anything about it. With a Green Amendment, we the people can do something about it when there's a problem.
Thank you. Let's jump to Mel for a moment. Mel, what does our Florida Constitution have now? Obviously, it doesn't have a lot of the things that Maya was just talking about. What does our Constitution say?
We have some pretty language in Article 2 of Section 7 that talks about, water and air pollution abatement and conserving and protecting our natural resources. But as Maya had noted, and in Florida law, the case law has been pretty clear that at least the majority of those clauses have been deemed to be policy statements. And that's how courts have been treating the constitutional language. Could they have gone beyond that? Of course. But in Florida, unfortunately, the choice has been to treat the constitutional language as not so much rights that are enforceable, but a nice to have advisories. And in one case, I believe it was Florida Wildlife Federation, I believe, versus the state in 1980, they had alluded to the fact that Floridians have a general right to a clean environment. But in that case, they were pointing to the cause of action created in one of the statutes as the enabling agent for being able to enforce that right. And of course, as we know, that particular statute is also limited. But so it's out there and it's about enforcement. And that's where the difference is between, general environmental rights that are pretty language and advisory policy statements and enforceable rights that we actually are empowered to protect ourselves.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maya, I'd like to go back to you. You spoke about that very important case back in 2012, 2013 in Pennsylvania. Has the Pennsylvania Green Amendment been helpful in subsequent cases?
It has. Since that 2013 victory, we've had a number of really powerful and important victories that help demonstrate how a Green Amendment can be helpful. But I do want to say, not every legal challenge that has come to bear has come down on the side of the challenger, the person that was challenging the government action that they were concerned about. But every case has resulted in a legal decision or an interpretation that has helped us more fully and robustly understand what it actually means to have a constitutional right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment. And sometimes what we learn is sort of the line of what is pure water, what is clean air. And sometimes it's about ensuring that the government goes through the right process in order to consider whether or not their actions or activities will result in a constitutional violation. And as long as the government does the work to not just consider applicable legislation and applicable regulations in a particular context, but they do the work of ensuring that they believe their proposed action will not result in a constitutional violation of the environmental rights of the people, and they can express and explain why that belief should be deemed valid, then the courts will often honor that government decision unless there is some demonstrated extreme substantive environmental outcome that belies that assertion. So I sort of want to say that, like, every case is important and gives us important clarity substantively, but also procedurally. But amongst the other kinds of victories that we've secured in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is we've been able to demonstrate that when there is an existing law that the government, environmental law, that the government is failing to enforce, and the result is serious and significant harm for people, that failure to enforce existing law could be deemed a constitutional violation. The best example of that is a site called the Bishop Tube site. It's a site that's super saturated with dangerous toxins, including trichloroethylene. It is a site where there are corporate entities that are super rich, that are legally responsible for cleaning up that site. It's a site where the state has known about this super saturated toxic condition since the 1980s. It's a site where the pollution plume in the groundwater is known to be spreading and has now spread more than a mile away from the site, contaminating additional surface streams and groundwater supplies. And it's a site where, rather than enforce that existing law, the existing law that requires these responsible corporate parties to clean up the toxins at the corporation's expense, where the government didn't do that. Instead, they negotiated a deal with the developer to allow development of that site while it remained in its toxic condition, allowing construction of 200 homes, bringing more than 200 new, families and residents to this still toxic site. We at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network teamed up with the local community, and we did a lot of advocacy around the law, but also around the constitutional right of the people. And then we ultimately brought a legal action. And in the course of one of the decisions that the court brought forth, the court made very clear that the government's failure to enforce that law in a way that was resulting in serious and significant environmental harm that would rise to that constitutional level, that failure to act was action. Long story short, we didn't even have to go all the way through the litigation. At this point, the government has recognized that they were wrong. The sweetheart deal has been nixed for the development, and the government is now proactively working to enforce the existing laws on the books and to secure cleanup of that toxic site. Just this past couple of months, based on, after years of advocacy and some legal action and some more advocacy, we now have the state of Pennsylvania putting forth some of the strongest drinking water mandates or standards with regards to PFAS, that man-made family of toxic chemicals proliferating throughout drinking water supplies and environments in Pennsylvania and nationwide, also in the state of Florida. It's a man-made family of chemicals that's been allowed to wreak environmental and human health havoc because there were no protections to prevent its use. Well, now in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, citing the Pennsylvania Green Amendment and the obligation to protect the right of the people to pure water, we now have really strong drinking water standards being put in place that's going to start to work to get those contaminants out of drinking water supplies. A local municipality relying on the Pennsylvania Green Amendment protected an old growth forest from a devastating development project. And the truth is, there are more examples in Pennsylvania, but also in Montana and New York that really demonstrate having this kind of protection is significant and meaningful and can be used to challenge bad legislation, bad regulation, bad permitting, the failure of government to act to address problems, but it can also be used proactively by government to make positive environmentally protective decisions like drinking water protections and protections of old growth forests, like the Attorney General relying on the Green Amendment when he brings enforcements, or the previous Attorney General would bring environmental enforcement actions. And we've also seen the Green Amendment not just legally relied upon by people and organizations who feel that they've been wronged by their government officials when it comes to recognition and protection of environmental rights, but some of the most effective legal challenges and arguments have been brought by municipalities and state entities who have used the Green Amendment to protect their own right and authority to better protect the environment in a variety of different contexts. So it really is used by everybody who wants to see good government action to protect our environment for present and future generations.
So just to confirm, it sounds like you're saying there has been systemic change. The DEP cruise ship is slowly turning to make good judgments almost ahead of time. They don't have to be challenged on every decision. There is systemic change. Am I correct in that? Am I misstating what you were saying?
No, I think that that's a really great observation and a great way to directly say it, Joe. It really, as you said, we don't have to wait for government to do it wrong and for somebody to challenge it, but we're starting to see government entities and agencies and decision makers recognize their constitutional duty to protect the environmental rights of the people and the natural resources of the state, and are embracing that constitutional duty as a way to proactively put in place good environmental decisions. And I do want to offer, you know, the interesting thing in Pennsylvania, but also in other states, and I know that this is also, you know, a concern in Florida, is much to the shock and surprise of many, it's very often the state environmental agency that is one of the biggest opponents of proposed green amendments when they are first put forth. And in fact, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, when we secured that powerful decision that breathed legal life into Pennsylvania's Green Amendment and made clear that all government officials had to honor this constitutional right of the people, it took years to get the Pennsylvania DEP to stop saying, but we don't have to listen to that. As long as we comply with legislation and regulation on the books, we've complied with the Constitution, which is 100% wrong. But as we've had additional legal precedent and clarity and positive uses by other government agencies like the Attorney General's office and like the governor's office, we started to really see this shift and this appreciation for the value of having this constitutional right of the people. And I say, you know, yes, one can view it as an obligation of government to better protect the environment, but I say it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for good government officials to better protect the environment. And we're seeing government officials in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania view it that way and embrace it that way, and starting to put in place proactive, positive change that avoids the human health and heartache and environmental harm caused by pollution and degradation, that avoids the economic costs that pollution and degradation inflicts on all of us, and that avoids the need for litigation because government is doing it right the first time around in a way that's better for everyone.
You mentioned Montana, and I think I heard recently that there is an effort to sort of undo the Montana amendment. Has it not been effective there? And that's why they're getting rid of it?
No, so it's really the opposite, because the amendment has been effective in Montana in recent years. That is why when we had a political shifting of the winds in the state to those being put in political office who have a much more conservative belief system, and one that does not embrace all the values of a clean, safe, and healthy environment for all of us, regardless of what your priority is, right? Health, family values, education, economics, jobs, right? You better accomplish all those goals when you protect the environment. But we have, there was at a recent election in Montana, there was this wholesale shift. And apparently there is one political party in office who has enough votes that they could cast the 2/3 ballot in each of the legislative houses, if they chose to, that would be necessary to amend the Constitution to remove the Green Amendment. But that points out one of the most beautiful things about a constitutional Green Amendment and why it's worth the work to get one, because it is a higher bar to get a constitutional right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment added to your state constitution, that means it's also a higher bar to get it removed. So in Montana, they would have to get a 2/3 vote in each of the legislative houses and then a vote of the people in order to remove the constitutional amendment. I think it is very questionable whether 2/3 of the elected politicians in that state or any state would be willing to go on record to say that the people do not have a right to clean water or clean air, that their children don't have a right to a healthy environment. That's a pretty powerful statement for a public official to take and to cast their vote, right, against that right of the people to fundamentals like clean water. But even if they did that, even if everybody in that political party or in that legislature were convinced to vote in such a stupid, horrifying way, the amendment or that modification, that amendment to the Constitution, the amendment to remove the amendment would have to go to the people. And a majority of the people would have to vote to remove their right to clean water and clean air. And I would suggest to you, I think it would be very, very difficult to convince that many people to say that, that they do not have a right to clean water, and that, to the contrary, government and industry actually has a right to put carcinogens and toxins and dangerous contaminants in their waterways for profit.
So I had to ask you, because you said it would have to be a majority of the voters to vote to remove it. Is that a simple majority? Is that a super majority? Because here in Florida, we have a proposal in our upcoming session to increase the threshold for a citizens initiative from a 60% to 66.67%. They're making it harder. What percentage of voters in Montana would have to vote against the amendment?
In Montana and in the majority of states, when you're going to have a constitutional amendment, it's in the legislature where often you can have a majority vote, but it has to be in 2 consecutive legislative sessions. But if you're going to have a vote once, it has to be some sort of super majority, 2/3 or 3/5. That's not everywhere. And in New Mexico, it's majority vote once in each of the legislative houses. But then when it gets to the people, it tends to be a simple majority vote.
Okay, thanks.
But what we see is when given the opportunity to vote positively for an amendment, like in the state of New York, the amendment passed by over 70% of the vote, right? So I think it's very typical in Florida and really nationwide, when people are given the opportunity through vote or survey or polling or whatever to cast their voice for better protection of the environment, we always see that the vast majority of people want to see increased protections. So I think that we will expect that in Florida and elsewhere. When people are given that opportunity to vote for a right to clean water, they instinctively know that it's the right thing to do. It would only be misinformation campaigns from the opposition that perhaps could confuse people into voting the wrong way. That would be a concern. And we, of course, know to anticipate that, because unfortunately, misinformation campaigns where people are twisting language and messaging and marketing to try to get people to vote against their own interests is a common practice now in the US.
I think I also heard you say that DEP was arguing that they only really have to follow legislation. They don't really have to follow the Constitution, which made me think of the recent New York case having to do with the first application of their Green Amendment, in which I believe the court said, state agencies do not have the discretion to ignore the Constitution. But their amendment was only like 15 words long. Mel, and my concern is that a higher court can override that court's decision. Mel, is this something we have to fear down here with our amendment? Did I ask that question clearly?
I was going to say, always be afraid. Oh, no. I would say that the fact that we had anticipated just about everything we could come up with. Like, we imagine ourselves the opposing interests of, we want to extract or exact harm wherever we want if it's going to give us extra dollars, and all of the legal attacks that could come against the amendment. And what we did was we looked through a lot of case law, quite a bit of case law, mostly Florida Supreme Court case law, but lots of others in appellate courts. But so the bottom line is, we've prepared for survivability of not only the Florida Supreme Court's review for ballot initiatives in general, but also post enactment. So once it gets enacted, once it gets to be part of the Constitution, any challenge that comes against it, we've done our homework as well. So what the fear part I was talking about is that sometimes you might not have the right agents, the right parties in the right cases, involved, or the right courts, or something's going to happen where you're going to have good cases be decided wrongly, or the wrong type of cases make weird law or bad law. That happens. That's just the natural course of jurisprudence. It takes time to flush out all of the wrinkles, iron out all the wrinkles, and flush out the rest of the stuff that's not part of what the intent of the drafters for a constitutional amendment. And fortunately, I think that the specificity of our amendment provides a lot of good protection for that end. So will there be cases not super awesome? Yes, probably, but over time, and hopefully sooner than later, we'll find that the amendment is well-established law and standards and principles that Florida courts, all the above, the government of Florida will stand to. So,
Thank you.
Can I add to that, Joe?
Sure, of course.
So I think it's a really good observation. People, whether they read my book or they, hear other Green Amendment talks or materials or press report or whatever, right? They may say, hey, wait a second, in all these other states that either have an amendment or where an amendment is proposed, the language is much broader. It is more inclusive in terms of the elements of the environment that are protected. It's simpler, shorter language. Doesn't that make sense for us to pursue here in Florida? And the answer to that is no. And it's no, because the vagaries of the Florida constitutional amendment interpretation and application process is really quite distinct and different from every other state. There is something that I had to learn from Mel and Joe and others, that, there's what they call in Florida the single subject rule. In Florida, you really can't protect the right to clean water and clean air and a stable climate, right? All these things that we see listed in other Green Amendment proposals. If you were to do that in Florida, your amendment proposal would be fundamentally legally flawed. And even if it got through, you got all the right signatures, ultimately it would fail. Because you can't do it that way under Florida law. So it's important, I think, to know that, I don't want to just say trust, but to know that there really is a powerful team of lawyers who really did scan and review, right, and assess all the elements of Florida constitutional law to figure out what is the right way to do it for Florida. And it's a process I actually use for every state has different language that's proposed, because it all depends on the unique personalities and aspects of the law in that state. that's what's happened in Florida. So I encourage you to really trust that in Florida, the language has to be more focused in terms of elements of the environment, but also has to be more detailed in terms of the elements of the actual crafting of the language in order to have a successful amendment that will withstand judicial scrutiny. And I will also just alert folks who don't know, right? I talked about in that Pennsylvania case, how we breathed legal life into Pennsylvania's amendment in 2013. Well, that's because for 42 years, there was bad precedent. There were bad cases that were brought early on. And it was bad choices by lawyers, frankly, bringing cases based on the environmental right that they had no business bringing a case based on an environmental right about. And so the judges took the opportunity to misinterpret and misapply the Pennsylvania amendment and render a determination that says it's not self-executing, that in fact, if you comply with the laws on the books, the regulations on the books, that is the same thing as complying with the Constitution, which it's not. The way constitutional law works is you have legislation and regulation, and the Constitution is its own legal obligation that has to be honored and fulfilled and applied. But the court said, no, they're all one and the same. Comply with the statutes, you've complied with the Constitution. So that's the way it was for 42 years. We overturned that bad precedent when we had the critical right case that really demonstrated the fallacy of that bad interpretation. But that in that story, there is a cautionary tale. When Florida, not if, when Florida gets the passage of the Florida right to clean water, it's going to be really important that people not just willy-nilly bring every single case and just throw the language in every legal action they bring. It's going to be really important that those first couple of cases are really smart, strong cases that make clear the importance of proper interpretation and application of the Florida right to clean water. So all the detail is going to be really helpful. But as Mel said, there's still a lot of power in the gavel of the justices. So we want to make sure that we bring good cases early on so justices do right by the Florida right to clean water and Floridians.
In a moment, I'll get back to you because you're making it sound like there could be a lot of cases, and I know it's a concern of citizens down here, but I believe we have a question about red tide. Janice, you want to ask your question?
Sorry, searching for unmute. My apologies. Yeah. This is all fantastic information, and it was such a joy to have you in Gainesville, and thank you so much for the info. Could you kindly take Joe's example of red tide, which is increasing all the time, and how we would how we would challenge red tide, or how we would use that as a case for the amendment when it passes?
So I am actually going to pass that one off to Mel, because I probably don't have, I know I don't have all of the details, the ins and outs of the causes, the applicable laws, the right necessary to actually do a fair answer to that question.
Thank you.
All righty. So as we generally know, red tide has been out there before humans, so it's not completely our fault that red tide exists, right? So what is our fault is our pollution of the waters and the nutrients that we put into the system that feeds and superfeeds the growth of red tide blooms. And not only has the frequency of red tide grown drastically, especially in Southwest Florida, but also the severity of the red tides has wreaked much more damage and harm to marine life, to humans. You're familiar with all of the irritation and the effects on humans. And of course, where
The
humans
effects
don't
on the
want to go.
memory, right?
Yeah, right, that too. So where humans don't want to go, they're not going to bring their pocketbooks to spend money in restaurants and hotels and things like that. So it's all very, all connected. So the answer is, it's the systemic feature of what the amendment will bring in reducing dramatically or closing the loop of human impact to Florida's waters and wherever they flow. So all the above, how we're going to do better in stormwater management, in wastewater management, both septic systems and sewers. The infrastructure is very fragile and crumbling, and that's not something you want to be right next to already a fragile and crumbling environment. So when we fix our stuff, we'll get our impact as close to zero as possible. So if and when we do see red tide, it'll be back to normal frequency, back to normal, manageable levels of, how it was before we messed things up. So I just wanted to mention, based on the number of months, and Joe had mentioned this in the very beginning, how from 1878 to 1994, okay, there were only 64 months of red tide. That's only 4.6 of the time red tide has been an issue out there since 1878. And in the last 30 years, there's been 200 months of red tide. And when you put the fraction into percentages, that becomes 58%. It's over half of the time that you have red tide is not good for business, not good for health, not good for safety. I mean, that's ridiculous. So it is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed and solved sooner than later. So thank you for bringing that up, Janice.
Yeah, no, and I hear you. And I think maybe you were thinking about the respiratory illness that people suffer when they walk on a beach with red tide.
Mhm.
So I understand those things. So it sounds to me like, since we have the backdrop of this is something that has existed previously, that has accelerated, the data that would be important are things like what you just read, and then perhaps a municipality that is suffering the economic hardship of not having tourists come because they don't want to have respiratory illnesses, that perhaps a municipality bringing that forward might be the way that this would be addressed. Is that how you see it, or are there other mechanisms or agents that you would see would bring up red tide?
I would say that we don't even need to get to that point. All there needs to be is proof that the state agency, someone under the amendment that is subject to the amendment, has an action or a policy of inaction that is causing harm to or threatens to harm Florida waters. That's all that needs to be brought to the court for there to be a decision and an injunctive relief. The court will look at it. Evidence can be shown to show that, yes, look at the harm, and or in the standing aspect of things. The plaintiff, this is important to me because my family goes there every year, and we can't anymore because of the red tide. That's when it would be brought up.
Right, and that's exactly the point I'm looking for.
Right.
I mean, if it goes to court, it's all well and good, but somebody has to take that forward. I mean, somebody has to bring this forward as an issue that is against the amendment. So that's exactly the question I'm asking. You mentioned an individual, but I would see more, and that's what I'm asking from your background. Are you missing a municipality? What other entities would bring that to the point where it goes to the court?
So in addition to the local government, city or county, you can even have a state agency as part of a plaintiff action, but also the businesses that are suffering because of red tide. So in addition to all the individuals, the nonprofits that care about the issue can take it to court. So just about everyone involved in that whole problem set has the right under the amendment to take it to the next step.
Okay, I could see one of our environmental groups taking that initiative. I mean, it's a huge undertaking to take something to court. So I appreciate that feedback.
Thank you, Janice. And that's a good segue. It is a huge undertaking to bring an action in court. Maya, there's a lot of concern down here that our amendment would give rise to a proliferation of lawsuits. You have experience in other states. Have you seen that happen?
So one thing to add, Janice, for that to the great answer and discussion you and Mel had is, remember, you're going to have to find that government action. Mel did mention this, but that government action that you're challenging, right? It's not just going to be writ large, red tide's a problem, right? You have to find specific things, and you're going to want to, yeah. So you have to find that. So I just want to add that, that additional emphasis on that point that was made. In terms of legal actions, we really don't. And I think, Joe, you rightly early on, you and I talked about the incredible importance of how the amendment refocuses the government to make good decisions that avoid litigation. And we are seeing that more and happening more and more, and getting more and more examples of that as Pennsylvania's amendment, New York's amendment is getting utilized, and Montana's as well. But when we look at litigation, people talk about litigation because it is a constitutional amendment, and like other fundamental rights, like the right to free speech or the right to bear arms. It's the legal actions that where there's a challenge and new precedent that gets set that tends to get the attention and the focus, not the day-to-day good things that are happening where litigation is being avoided. So that's why people naturally ask about the litigation. But what we see in terms of litigation in the 3 states where we have a green amendment is in the number of cases that make it into the courts. There are cases that happen at the administrative level, and they tend to get handled at that lower level. But the number of cases that make it into the courts is less than 10 a year. It's like 3 to 9 a year between Pennsylvania, Montana, and New York with its new amendment is right there in the middle, 4 or 5 cases. Is what we see, and no cases have been characterized or dismissed as frivolous. They're all important cases addressing serious and significant issues of community and environmental concern.
Question: does a positive decision in one state regarding the Green Amendment influence decisions in other states? Will a judge in a court down here take into consideration what a judge in a different state said in an analogous case?
They absolutely can. They don't have to. It's not precedent, but they absolutely can. And given that there are so few green amendments, right? And when a green amendment gets implemented in or added to a state's constitution, it's going to be sort of a new conversation, a new dynamic. There are standard principles of constitutional and legal interpretation that will come into play that will be very helpful to judges, but it's going to be a really helpful guide for judges in Florida or elsewhere to look at Pennsylvania, Montana, and New York, where the judges have already very successfully and effectively sort of laid out the rules of the road in how a green amendment works. So every time we have a new state that gets added to, this list of states with green amendments, and we get good government action or valuable legal decisions that come out, it will help inform what's happening in other states. And I also believe that as our green amendment grows, right, the synergistic positive value that comes from having state after state after state advancing, seeking, securing, utilizing a constitutional right of the people to a clean, safe, and healthy environment, it's going to have positive benefits in all other states, right? It's going to be inspirational. It's going to provide legal guidance. It's going to provide good government guidance. And it's going to be harder and harder for political officials and judges to say, whoa, no, not in our state, because we're going to really be lifting up this demand nationwide for people to have this constitutional right to clean water, clean air, a stable climate, and healthy environments. I think there's incredible complementary synergistic values as this as this Green Amendment movement grows.
Terrific. We only have very few minutes left, and I think we may have a question or two. Wendy, you have a question?
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks so much, Maya. Like, your work is so revolutionary. I mean, everybody here, but yeah, it's, I mean, paving the way for so many positive things. And on that note, I think that just having a lot of public scrutiny will also kind of shed light on bad judges, we'll say that, or, you know, what would normally happen in the darkness. So I think it's beautiful just having the conversation. I'm curious your comments on this whole kind of, say, corporate takeover of governance, in a sense where we see what's happening in Ohio right now, where the water testing is being done by the train company that caused the disaster in Fort Lauderdale. They just privatized the water and actually the drinking water. And in the contract, it actually says that the water quality standards don't have to meet legal standards, only the standards of the contract. And any new laws would be a relief event that the project company could file for claims against the city. So just your comments on that. And just one more quick little thing I want to share with you guys when it's published, but I just finished a project for my boss yesterday where he had me make a list of all the states that allow amendments and statute initiatives and referendums with and I included all of the stuff about supermajorities, like all of the details on what states allow what. So I'll make sure to pass that on. It's going to be open source to everybody. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, that's going to be super helpful and a wonderful resource. And I really appreciate you, Wendy, and everything you're doing. And I'm going to appreciate that resource because right now I just go state by state, you know, and looking it up. So that'll be super helpful. And if you're up for it, we will share a link to it definitely on the forthegenerations.org website. And I think, you know, you're really right. Under our current political system and system of governance, industry does have much more power. They have more power when legislators are legislating. They have more power in helping to influence whether or not environmental agencies enforce the laws that are already on the books, or how the terms are interpreted, you know, that are in those laws, whether they're interpreted in a way that's strong or that's weak. You know, I mean, we hear all the time about industry just getting a slap on the wrist when there's a violation. And often that slap on the wrist is actually to help that corporation evade a legal challenge that might actually come from the public that would be legally allowed under some other law. So you're right. It's a big problem, and sort of the I would say corporate takeover of government manifests itself in many, many forms. But that is one of the values of having a Green Amendment, is when we can show that government is using its authority or not using its authority in a way that's resulting in devastating environmental harm that rises to the constitutional level. We can go and bring that legal challenge, make that constitutional demands, and that company doesn't have higher standing. They are now on the same playing field. When we challenged that anti-fracking law, the corporations weaseled their way into the courtroom, but they did not have higher legal standing power or access to the judges than we did, because the rules prevented that. Right? The rules allow industry and the agencies and the government officials to talk together all the time, right? But when you get into that legal system, there are limitations on that. So that really is one of the values of the Green Amendment, is it really does help level the playing field so that we, the people, aren't left out in the cold while industry and government, you know, make their own plans in ways that will result in significant and serious harm.
Maya, thank you very, very much. We are at 4:59. It's terrific having you here. We have 1 minute left. I want to give that to Mel, because this is the end of our fourth and final FAQ Friday, but we have a pretty significant virtual event coming up on March 2nd. Mel, if you would like to speak about that.
Sure. Thank you, Joe. And Maya will be one of our special guests to that virtual press conference. Another special guest will be Erin Brockovich, who has been very public in her support for the Florida the Florida Right to Clean Water Initiative and Green Amendments movement nationally. So we're looking forward to what that looks like in the future. But we also have lots of good, wonderful voices from throughout the state that represent various either industries or components of what makes Florida, Florida. And we're very much looking forward to hearing their perspectives as well and why they support and understand the need for and support this constitutional amendment. So that is going to be a very big, big event. Not only are we updating everyone with where the campaign is currently and what needs to happen next, but we're also, it's a big all call to action type of alert of if we as Floridians really want this to happen, this is what we all need to do right now. And we're not going to hold back in any niceties, but this is the real plain truth of this. If we want it, we need to get it ourselves. So that's going to be a takeaway message, and it'll be very educational and informative and hopefully very motivating for everyone who attends. So if you're subscribed to the website, receiving our email updates already, you'll be getting the link. And if you're not, go ahead and do that. You can always unsubscribe later if you really need to, but that's how we're going to be sending the link out. And we look forward to everyone appearing that day. So thank you, Maya, again for today and next week and all the future and all the past help that you've been giving. So and thank you all for attending, and thanks, Joe.
Yep, thanks everybody. Have a good night, folks.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
You're amazing, amazing people. Have a great night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.